All right. Well, we have a pretty packed agenda for the day, so I'm going to go ahead and kick it off. Welcome, everyone, to the latest Drawdown Georgia webinar. We have a really great program planned to officially launch the new Drawdown Georgia Greenhouse Gas Emissions Tracker. My name is Blair Beasley, and I am the Director of Climate Strategies for the Ray C. Anderson Foundation. We have been proud to support Drawdown Georgia in its efforts to grow high-impact climate solutions in our state. And now, thanks to the work of researchers at Georgia Tech and University of Georgia, we can track our progress as we collectively move on this journey to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and protect and expand our natural carbon sinks in Georgia. We will be hearing today from some of the team of researchers led by Dr. William Drummond that collaborated on this new interactive tracker. As you will see, Georgians now have data at their fingertips showing where emissions come from at the state and county level. It's all based on publicly available data from the federal government, and this data will be updated monthly. You can explore the greenhouse gas emissions tracker on the Drawdown Georgia website, as well as on Georgia Tech's website. A few programming notes before we dive in and hear more about how the tracker works and some key takeaways about what you can learn. I'm going to briefly introduce our panel for today, and then following their presentations, we will be opening it up for audience Q&A. Ollie Chapman, who's a PhD student from Georgia Tech, who's been working with Drawdown Georgia for the past 2 years, will be capturing all of your questions and will pose a few to the speakers at the end of the program. So please add your questions to the chat box and the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to get to as many of them as possible. And now for some quick intros. First, we're going to be hearing from Dr. William Drummond, who is the lead researcher on this project. Dr. Drummond is an associate professor in the College of Design at Georgia Tech, where he directs the Master of Science in Geographic Information Science and Technology degree program. He's taught at Georgia Tech since 1987 and currently teaches courses in climate change planning, climate change analytics, GIS programming, socioeconomic GIS, and PhD statistical methods. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Marilyn Brown. Dr. Brown is a Regents Professor in the School of Public Policy at Georgia Tech, where she created and co-leads the Climate and Energy Policy Lab and the Master of Sustainable Energy and Environmental Management. She also co-directs the research program supporting Drawdown Georgia. Dr. Brown's research focuses on the design and modeling of energy markets and carbon reduction policies and programs. Then we'll hear from David Eady. David is the Senior Manager for Industry Engagement at the Ray C. Anderson Center for Sustainable Business at the Scheller College of Business at Georgia Tech, where among many other things, he helps to lead the new Drawdown Georgia Business Compact. Prior to joining Georgia Tech, David spent over 23 years leading sustainability initiatives and facilitating stakeholder engagements through various professional and civic roles. And then last but not least, we'll hear from Dr. Jacqueline Mohan. Dr. Mohan is an associate professor of terrestrial ecosystem ecology and biogeochemistry at the Odum School of Ecology at the University of Georgia. Her lab investigates the role of global change on trees and other plants, soil biogeochemistry, soil microbes, insect herbivores, and particularly terrestrial ecosystems. And with that, I think we should get started. So Dr. Drummond, I will turn the mic over to you to kick off the program.
Thank you, Blair, and afternoon, everyone. If we could have the next slide, Jen. This is the Drawdown Georgia Greenhouse Gas Emissions Tracker. And I'll start by giving you the URL to access the tracker on the web. But you have to promise me you won't go there until after the webinar is over. So it's not hard to remember, though, drawdownga.org/tracker. So Once we're finished the webinar, you're invited to go ahead and experiment with the interactive tracker. But I'm here to give you a tour of the main features of the tracker. And this was built over the last year by students and faculty here at Georgia Tech and University of Georgia. And it happens as we tour the tracker, we will also be touring the state of Georgia and even a little bit of the history of the state of Georgia. So let's get started and go to the next slide. And then go ahead and the next slide here. There are a couple things I want to mention at the beginning. You see the box there in the upper left to indicate this is October 2021. And so the emissions tracker is built around monthly emissions. And so most of the numbers that you see will be referring to numbers. We'll be referring to monthly data, for instance, October. But there is data going back to January 2005. So next. Here at the top of the map that has the centerpiece in the tracker, there are a couple things to note. First, the tracker starts out with statewide Georgia emissions. So the graphs and charts and numbers refer to Georgia as a whole at the beginning. Second thing is we are keeping track of net greenhouse gas emissions. And so that is emissions from human activities minus CO2 uptake from forests, for instance. So if we subtract human emissions, if we take human emissions and subtract forest emissions, that's net emissions. The third thing is many of the numbers refer to emissions per 1,000 people. And so that allows us to compare emissions from large population areas and small population areas. So that makes it much easier to go from one to another. So next, we're going to start by looking at 4 numbers that are key to understand emissions in the state of Georgia. So the first one is emissions per 1,000 people in metric tons. And metric tons is the basic unit of emissions that's used everywhere in the world, including the US. And so what this number is saying that across Georgia as a whole, the average emissions in October were 667 metric tons per 1,000 people. So a little Georgia Tech level math, you would conclude rightly that each of us in October was responsible for about 2/3 of a metric ton of emissions. So next, please. Now we can translate that into pounds per person. And so those metric tons per 1,000 translate into 1,470 pounds of CO2 per person in this 1 month. Now, a metric ton is about 2,200 pounds, a little more than a regular ton, a short ton in the US. So this is a lot of emissions per person for 1 month. So next. Now, from the top-down perspective of the atmosphere doesn't care so much about emissions per person. It cares about the amount of greenhouse gases that's coming into the atmosphere. So the total amount of Georgia greenhouse gases for the month of October was 7.3 million metric tons. And so it's these amounts of metric tons that are causing the climate to destabilize and to warm. So next. And then if we add up all the emissions from the months to date up through October, we had 85 million metric tons of emissions in Georgia. And so we still have a couple months to collect the data and publish it for. So probably by the end of the year, we will be up to the level of 100 million metric tons of emissions for the state of Georgia. So next. So the centerpiece is the map. And by looking at the map, you can see the distribution of high emission levels and low emission levels across the state. And you'll see multiple versions of this map in different sections of the presentation. So next. Now you can take your mouse and move it over any individual county. Don't click yet, just move your mouse over a county and hover over that county, and you will get a pop-up with the crucial numbers for that county. So if you move your mouse over Chatham County, the city of Savannah, you can get the equivalent 4 numbers for that county. And so Chatham County had 1,105 metric tons per 1,000 people. Not quite double the statewide average, but significantly more. And so we're not going to go into details, but since Savannah is the 3rd busiest port in the United States, it's not surprising that it has a high level of transportation emissions from trucking and diesel fuel and industrial emissions from industry located there. So next. Then if you move to the northeast corner of Georgia and hovered your mouse over Rabun County, you would get these 4 numbers. And you'll notice some changes. The numbers are now green and they're all negative. What this means is Rabun County had more forest uptake, which we represent as negative numbers, than it did human emissions in the month of October. And so Rabun County was below zero, was below net zero because of the preponderance of trees in the county. So next. Now, if you go a step further and click the mouse over a county, you will still see the preview, but you'll see everything on the dashboard will change, and the numbers and the charts and the other information will now show information for that county. And so the numbers remain the same, but if we can have the next slide here. So the bar chart is now showing emissions for different sectors for Rabun County. And if we have next, I'll highlight the forestry emissions. You can see that they overwhelm the human emissions, even though there still are emissions from people. But the negative bar there shows how much Rabun County is contributing to reducing CO2 in the atmosphere. So hit next, please. And you can look over in the lower left corner and see the time series chart is now showing Rabun County emissions. And so one interesting thing in this time series chart, if we could have the next slide, at the very middle, right around 2013, Rabun transitioned from positive emissions to negative emissions. And so that transition that Rabun County went through is what we all need to do across the state of Georgia and the U.S. as a whole. And in the world, we need to make the transition from positive emissions to net zero emissions. And that's what we need to do to stabilize the climate and hand a stable climate to our children and grandchildren. So next slide. Now, every once in a while, the dashboard can get kind of tangled up on itself. And if you want to go back to the initial screen, I highlight in the upper left-hand corner, it says clear all selections. So if you should get turned around or for some reason nothing is showing, no emissions anywhere, you can clear all selections and just go back to the initial screen. And so every screen will have one of those bars on it. So next, we continue our tour in Northwest Georgia. If you click on the last A in Chattanooga, you will hit Whitfield County, Georgia. And if we go next, Whitfield County industrial is the majority of emissions. And so here in blue, and in fact, Whitfield County is one of the counties in the very large cluster of carpet and floor covering industries. So next, now we'll take a brief detour. You see, I've highlighted over here county info in the little window that shows part of the database. And so hit next, please, Jen. If you click on this last column of county info for a county, what you will see is, next, Jen, will take you to the New Georgia Encyclopedia entry on that county. And so New Georgia Encyclopedia is the authoritative source of information about Georgia's geography, history, and culture. So if you want to find out more about your county or any county, you can click on the info section. And there is fascinating information in the New Georgia Encyclopedia about Catherine Evans Whitener, who, when she was 15 years old, revived and perfected a new way of tufting. And that method of tufting, which she did for quilts, turned out to be perfect for manufacturing carpets. And so it's her invention or reinvention that eventually led to this huge concentration of carpet and floor covering manufacturers. So next, please. And to jump forward to today, the company Interface is one of those carpet and floor covering manufacturers. And Interface was founded and led for a long time by Mr. Ray C. Anderson, who is the was the CEO and is the person for whom the Ray C. Anderson Foundation is named, that is supporting the dashboard and Drawdown, Georgia. So next, we'll jump to the Southwest County, Seminole County, Georgia, and then hit next again. And here, agriculture emissions are the dominant source of emissions. And so transportation, industry, agriculture can all be dominant sources in different places of Georgia. So next, we can do next. We finish our tour in Fulton County, Georgia, home of Georgia Tech, where if you hit next again, our two primary sectors, actually one more time for next, are transportation and commercial. And commercial includes everything that's not industrial, including government and Georgia Tech. So, so the commercial sector is especially concentrated here in this seat of government. So next slide. Now, I'll finish up. There's lots more detail. There are lots of things to click on in the dashboard. And at the bottom right of your screen, there are buttons to take you to places that have significantly more detail about different areas of the dashboard. And so go ahead and hit 3 nexts in a row there, Jen. That the electricity, the business sector, and the forestry sector are all sectors that have additional detail. And our next three speakers will actually go into detail about electricity, business emissions, and forestry. So again, after the webinar is open, I invite you to go and test the dashboard and explore to your heart's content. So back to you, Blair.
Thank you so much. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Brown.
Thank you very much. And Bill, that was a great intro. Let's go to the next slide. We're going to dig into the electricity sector, starting first with emissions from the consumption of electricity, and then we'll turn to emissions from the generation of electricity. So in this chart, there is a display of emissions from electricity consumed each month in Georgia as a whole in the right box, and in each of the 159 counties, as was done before, by color coding each of them. Emissions are measured in metric tons per 1,000 people. I chose to focus on August because that's more exciting as a season for power generation. Homes in Georgia were responsible for emitting about 6.5 million tons, you see in the upper right box, of CO2 from electricity in that month to heat, cool, light, and live in their homes. On average, that's about 1.3 pounds per person. When you move your cursor over to Fulton County, you see this box pop up. And again, focusing on the county in which Georgia Tech is located, it has 726 emissions, that is, metric tons of CO2 emissions per 1,000 people, relative to the state average of 591. And its total emissions in the month of August were quite high, and for the year at 5.6 million is more than 10% of the total for the state. For the year of 46 million, you can see in the upper right-hand box again. Go ahead and go forward, Jen. Yep, I think I've not kept up with my boxes. Let's go to the next slide. Oh, previous slide, sorry. I forgot to mention that in the left side, the Keeling type curve, that's what we call that, absorption emission of CO2 from forestry, showing so clearly in the ups and downs. But you can see again that for electricity generated emissions from the consumption of electricity, we are on a downward trend. And in Fulton County in August of 2010, the emissions were about almost half of that of what they are in 2021. Of course, there's always weather, and that has to be considered when you're making any comparison. But in this chart here, you can see the 46 million tons of emissions from electricity, which is the last point on the chart, is nearly half of that of what it was in the year 2005. And that, of course, is the benchmark year for the Paris Accords. We like to compare ourselves to that point in time for comparisons. Let's go forward now. So we can look at emissions in Fulton County and for the state from electricity consumption in homes, in commercial buildings, and in industry. Let's toggle to the next. There we go. We're going to focus a bit on residential and keep on going. Residential is much larger than in Fulton County than commercial and industrial sectors are in the month of August. In fact, in general, Fulton County has very low emissions from industry, particularly in comparison to the rest of this highly industrialized state of Georgia. Let's go to the next slide. So this shows the size of commercial emissions, 394 emissions from the commercial sector in the year 2021, just this past August, per 1,000 people. much higher than the average for the state of Georgia, which is 194. If you keep toggling, I think that upper right-hand box might highlight. Let's go to the next slide now. Industry, again, much smaller for industrial emissions from electricity. Let's keep going. Now, here's the comparison over time. Again, seeing the significant reduction in the past 11 years. Let's keep going. Again. And one more time. So in looking at highs and lows across the state of Georgia, I tried to ponder the explanation for some counties having very low emissions while others have high. And the two with very low emissions that I've chosen to highlight are Long County here, first of all, which is an anomaly because it's located in southeast Georgia, which is very warm. And one would expect it to have higher than average emissions. Instead, its emissions in August were 187 metric tons per 1,000 people relative to 274 for the state as a whole. So in Googling it and going to the county information there on our chart, I discovered that Long County is amongst the 10th poorest in the nation. And we know that emissions and consumption track income. So that's a pretty strong explanation there. Keep on going. Next, yep. Okay, Terrell County, one of a couple of fairly high emitting counties at 481 compared to the average for the state of 274 for residential emissions from electricity consumption. And here we have, I think, the needs of a very hot climate and a reasonably prosperous county sufficient to be able to manage the HVAC requirements of their residents. Okay, next. And Baker, much the same. Okay. Oh, I did want to remind you all that the emissions from Fulton County are much higher than these two counties in the consumption of residential electricity. So almost across the board, anything to do with residential and commercial consumption is very high in Fulton. Next. So we're not going to be talking about emissions from the consumption of electricity and transportation because it pretty much rounds to zero. In fact, we don't have a person talking about emissions from transportation as a whole just because of time. But I did want to take this opportunity to show you that one of our aspirations for the tracker is to turn from tracking emissions to tracking solutions. And we've begun to do that with the same Power BI software platform. Here you can see the location of charging stations per EV ownership on the right, and the location of charging stations in the metro areas that dominate due to affluence and EV ownership. So trying to spin a explanation for why we find climate solutions where they are, and eventually to link these to emissions by county. Now let's turn to the next dashboard. So this is a different look. It's the dashboard of emissions from electricity generation. And here we cover two states rather than just Georgia. We add Alabama because a significant amount of Georgia's electricity is produced from power plants in Alabama. And I highlighted one here in particular, which is the Gaston plant. It has 4 gas plants and 1 coal plant. It's owned by Alabama Power, which is owned by the parent company Southern, which also is the parent company of Georgia Power. And so there's an arrangement whereby Georgia Power purchases some of the electricity that Georgia needs from Gaston. This plant is slated for retirement in the integrated resource plan that was just published a month ago by the Georgia Power Company. And in fact, I'm going to talk quite a bit as I walk you through where our power plants are located, what their future might be if the integrated resource plan is accepted and moves forward. Next. So I'm going to highlight some of the coal plants in Georgia now. Wansley, outside of Carrollton, between Carrollton and Newnan, is going to be retiring first of the next tranche to retire. And keep on going. You can see the next. You can see a few more of our large coal plants here. Plant Shearer with 4 units just north of Macon. Several of these are going, 2 of these are going to be retired soon, and 2 later beyond the 2030 period that we're looking at. And go again, please. Plant Bowen has 2 units that are going to be retired in the next few years. And that has sparked a significant focus on electricity reliability in North Georgia, because without that, a coal plant, there is a potential issue, shortfall that will have to be dealt with through transmission infrastructure and investment and other assets. Next. Wanted to highlight that we do have some peaking plants. This one, McManus, south of Savannah. It runs on petroleum. It's not used very much, but when it is used, it's quite dirty. So we do also show, for instance, now if you keep going one more, I think you'll see when you select a particular type of plant on the left side there, the plant primary fuel is where you flag the plants you want to see. And then that left-hand panel drops down a menu that identifies by name all of the plants that are solar. So this is a solar energy project in southwest Georgia that has just come online, privately owned, but its electricity is purchased by the Georgia Power Company through a purchase power agreement. I wanted to end on solar because it is the focus of, it is the, I think, most exciting aspect of the plans for Georgia's electricity sector over the next 20 years, with at least 2,000 megawatts of new solar being planned by our primary retail distributor. I think that's my last slide. And so you can go to the next slide. There we go. And over to David Eady, or perhaps Blair in between.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Brown. That was great. David Eady, I will turn the mic over to you.
Great. And you can go ahead, go to the next slide, and then the next slide. I'm going to talk just real briefly about the fact that while University of Georgia, Georgia Tech, and Emory University were working on some of the foundational research into climate solutions for Georgia, that is the Drawdown Georgia initiative, we were working with our corporate partners and talking about how do we leverage the leadership that we do see with businesses in the state that are already pursuing very ambitious carbon reduction goals, and build a collective impact initiative that will accelerate the deployment of those 20 solutions even further and faster. So we launched in October of 2021, the Drawdown Georgia Business Compact, and it is really intended to be a diverse group that represents the diversity of Georgia's economy in terms of size of company, where they're located, what their levels of carbon ambition are, and that they're representing different sectors. And so the goal here is to move the state of Georgia towards net zero by 2050, with obviously some intermediate goals as well. So next slide. We currently have 23 members of 23 companies that have joined the Drawdown Georgia Business Compact. Here are the logos of those companies here. This number continues to grow as we accelerate our outreach efforts. Let me know if you'd like to see your logo here. Next slide. So as the Ray C. Anderson Center for Sustainable Business, we are focusing our efforts on 4 channels of work. One is on facilitating collaborative initiatives among the compact members. Another is looking for ways to catalyze innovation throughout the state, building on a very robust innovation ecosystem we have here in Georgia. And the next is to create a community of practice of practitioners where they're sharing lessons learned and best practices and growing together. And then lastly, that we're reporting on progress. How are we doing towards moving the needle on carbon emissions for Georgia, moving towards that net zero by 2050 goal. So it's on this report on progress element in particular that the dashboard is relevant to, but it's also relevant in terms of how we target our outreach and where we seek solutions. So next slide. The data that we're going to be looking at in the dashboard in just a moment is based on facility level greenhouse gas emission data that's self-reported by various industries in Georgia on an annual basis. And it is, you can organize the data in a variety of ways. These charts show it by the NAICS codes, the North American Industry Classification System. And you can see that if you take out utilities, which Marilyn spoke about, electric generation, if you take out utilities, then which is obviously a large amount of the emissions reported, the next big wedge is manufacturing, and then after that is waste management. So we're going to take a little look at where those emissions can be found in the state. And then in looking at manufacturing emissions, the biggest piece of that is the pulp and paperboard industry in Georgia, followed by pesticide, fertilizer, and other agricultural chemicals. And that 22% for that second category is all coming from one plant in Augusta, and I'll show you where that show you that in just a moment as well. So next slide. So this is a display that shows you the various facilities in Georgia that have reported this data to the US EPA through the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program. And the size of the bubble represents the relative amount of emissions that are reported by that facility. And so the color coding is showing you the different industry types that are captured in that data set from EPA. So what we're going to do is go to the next slide and start diving into some of that data. So if you just look at the manufacturing, so we've taken all but just the manufacturing facilities, you can see how they're spread across the state and the relative amount of emissions from any one facility. And you can hover over any one of these bubbles and see which facility that is and how much those emissions are. So next slide. When we start to look at sort of diving into those manufacturing emissions and taking a look at pulp and paper and paperboard industry, you can see that they're primarily located along major waterways in Georgia, and they're scattered throughout the state, but mostly in middle to south Georgia. And so as we think about our outreach to the pulp and paper and paperboard industry, this helps us to achieve our goal of being representative of the various geography in Georgia with our compact. And so we are in conversation with several of these companies that fall within this particular industry code. Next slide. This is that company in Augusta that makes fertilizer, and the release of CO2 in the production of or manufacturing of the fertilizer. So it has a fairly large footprint. The amount of emissions from this site is 1.73 million metric tons. So that one facility is almost 2% of Georgia's total greenhouse gas emissions for the year. And so if we can work with this company to reduce their emissions, we can make a really significant impact. So this goes to how knowing what the emissions are, who is responsible for the emissions, and what industry are involved, it can help guide us in terms of not just our outreach, but also looking at which solutions are appropriate to bring to bear on those emissions. So next slide shows an industry that I'm not sure how many people that are from the metro Atlanta area are familiar with, but Georgia has a very rich kaolin mining industry and expands across the fall line of Georgia. That middle band, you can see that concentration of companies there that mine the kaolin, which is a type of clay in middle Georgia, and then use it in various products that are manufactured in Georgia. And then there's also other mineral related industries such as glass manufacturing in Georgia as well. So there could be opportunity to look at the industrial processes associated with some of these mineral related industries and see if there's some commonalities that can be focused on for solutions to implement solutions to reduce these emissions. The big circle in the middle is a cement manufacturing plant. For those of you who don't know, cement manufacturing is extremely carbon intensive. And so that's another one of those great targets of opportunity for partnering with industry to reduce emissions. And the next slide, we take a look at animal processing and food manufacturing. You probably all know that Georgia is the chicken processing capital of the world up in Gainesville, Flowery Branch area. And that's represented in those two bubbles up there. Then there's also Tyson has a plant down in Southwest Georgia, which has some significant emissions. And then over in Savannah, you have a sugar and confection manufacturing facility. They make sweet stuff over in Savannah. So that's knowing, again, where these emissions are coming from and what industries are at play will help us with targeting our outreach and pursuit of solutions. So next slide is my last one, and that's taking a look at the waste industry. These circles represent landfills throughout the state of Georgia. And about 50% of these landfills are publicly owned. They're owned by either a city or county. So it presents a great opportunity for industry to partner with local governments to find ways to maybe capture that methane that's being released from these landfills and generate electricity or have other uses, other ways of reducing emissions associated with landfills in Georgia. Because waste is a significant portion of the carbon footprint in the state in terms of the industry-related reported emissions. So that's the last of my slides, I believe. And just, again, the point for us is having this facility-level data and being able to drill down into, who's involved, where are the facilities, and even looking at, what are the processes that are associated with those emissions really helps us in thinking about our outreach and thinking about deploying solutions that have been researched through the Drawdown Georgia initiative. So back to you, Blair.
Thanks, David. So we've been talking about emissions, and we're going to turn it over to Dr. Mohan to talk a little bit about our natural carbon sinks in the state.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So today I'm going to talk to you about how beautiful negative numbers are and how lovely dark green is, because these are the places and the numbers that represent sequestration by our land-based ecosystems. And in Georgia, that means largely forests. Earth has three natural sinks or places to store carbon, whether it's carbon being emitted by natural processes like plants and microbes, or carbon that's being emitted by human activities. And we have three places, but only one of them is safe. We could let the carbon go to the atmospheric sink, where it's leading to higher levels of CO2 and climate change. We could let the emitted carbon go to the oceans, where it's leading to ocean acidification. Or we can let the carbon emitted by natural cycles or humans go to land-based ecosystems. And of those, forests are the most important. We in Georgia are blessed with forests. About 60% of our state is forested. We are the #1 timber state in the nation. And I want to point out that we have gorgeous dark green negative emissions. In other words, carbon sequestration, carbon storage counties, dark green all throughout the state, from the mountains to the Piedmont to the coastal plain. We are lucky in terms of forests in the state of Georgia. Next, I'd like to point out the bar graph on the right-hand side of the screen, where we're looking in the month of August. We're examining the different carbon sectors in the state of Georgia. And the dark green bar on the far right of that graph shows that our forest sector in the growing season month of August, actually offsets the state's #1 carbon emitter in that month. Far left bar in gray, that of transportation. Our forests more than make up for the carbon being emitted by our transportation carbon. I think click, not next slide, but hopefully that'll do the boxy things. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm behind. Please click again. Please click again. Please, I think we're ready to go, yes, to the next slide, where we're focusing now on forest carbon dynamics, emissions, and sequestration. Maybe, there we go. Excellent, thank you. I'd like to draw your attention again to the map in the middle. And here again, we're looking at forest carbon dynamics for the state of Georgia in the month of August, last August. And I'd like to draw your eye to the dark green patch of the Okefenokee swamp in the southeast part of the state. Okefenokee is extraordinarily cool in so many ways. If you haven't yet been there, please do go. It's amazing. It's amazing hydrologically, biodiversity wise, and it's amazing for the globe's carbon impacts. In fact, the power of carbon sequestration in the Okefenokee, keep in mind, this is a largely swamp forest. So we have both big trees, many of them conifers, and then we have this wonderfully organic, that means carbon, peaty-based soils. They store a lot of carbon too. So we're talking carbon in trees, carbon in soils. And the carbon benefit of storage in and around the Okefenokee extends to surrounding counties. If you want to hit, please, the, oh, okay, that's all right. I was going to talk about the top 3 for the state. Carbon storing counties in the state are right around the Okefenokee swamp. We have that of Ware County storing 86 metric tons of carbon per 1,000 people per year. I'm just talking right now about the county based. We have Clinch County in the same area storing 77 metric tons of carbon per 1,000 persons and I said per year, I'm sorry, I meant per the month of August. Charlton County, you're up there too. The top 3 counties in the month of August in the entire state at taking in and storing carbon are those around the Okefenokee. And now we can look at the month of Georgia for the whole state, the numbers in the boxes on the top right of the slide. And you can see in terms of emissions, if it's possible to go to the left with the box, one more click maybe. Oh, never mind. I won't click anymore. I will point out the number -493. That's almost 500 metric tons of carbon being stored in this month per 1,000 people for the state of Georgia. That's almost half a metric ton of carbon being stored, not in the people, but in the forest ecosystems per person. That's really extraordinary. And translated into pounds, that means in the state of Georgia, in the month of August, our forests stored over 1,000 1,000 pounds of carbon per person. This otherwise would freely go to the atmosphere and enhancing the climate warming of really the whole planet. Georgia is important, not just for the state of Georgia and the eastern United States, but frankly for the whole planet. And this last figure that's highlighted now, and thank you, depicts this. What we're looking at here are emissions, monthly based emissions going over time for the state of Georgia from 2005 through 2021, October, I believe. And you can notice the long-term negative line, but since we're talking of negative emissions, we're talking below the 0 metric ton line. We're talking carbon storage. The more negative the emission, the more carbon that's being stored. So Georgia is important for the whole global and national and regional carbon discussion. We're storing more and more carbon over time as the years go by. And you can also notice the up and down oscillations of the storage dynamics. This depicts two different things, and these things actually have global, spatial, and temporal relevance. We are growing more forests now because of agricultural land abandonment in the early to mid 20th century. This is true across the eastern United States, and it's true in many other parts of the globe as well. We're growing trees, and with our long, warm growing seasons in Georgia, we're growing bigger, faster trees. We're storing more and more carbon because of forests developing over time, getting bigger, taking in more carbon. And then we have these interesting up and down blips, these seasonal blips on this figure. This is showing us the importance of the growing season and the winter seasons of the Northern Hemisphere, where, of course, we live in Georgia. Most of Earth's land systems are in the Northern Hemisphere. The Northern Hemisphere seasons rule the global carbon budget. And that, of course, has direct implications for the global carbon cycles. So we take in more carbon in the growing season. We take in less carbon in the winter season of the Northern Hemisphere, i.e. that of Georgia. And I just like to make the point that Georgia is incredibly important, and more precisely, all of Georgia, but especially our forest-based trees and soil ecosystems are so important for Georgia, but they're important for the whole nation, the whole North America, and the globe as a whole. And thank you very much for listening. And of course, I could, but I won't list all the other amazing reasons forests are important: biodiversity, filtering out pollution in water and air, providing jobs, and free, low-cost recreational abilities for people. Thank you. And I will turn it over to Blair. And thank again, everyone.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mohan. Well, we're about to open it up for the Q&A section, which my colleague Ollie is going to be leading. But before we do, I'm just going to ask one quick question to Dr. Drummond. I'm curious, as you were building this, if there was a data trend or a high-level takeaway that surprised you or stood out to you as this was all coming together.
Well, what surprised me, and probably shouldn't have, but as a person who drives in Atlanta traffic and seeing the increase in traffic and population, I would have never thought that our emissions are actually going down rather than going up. Now, they're not going down nearly rapidly enough to get us to net zero and stabilize the climate. But you heard hints of that from Dr. Brown in our transition from coal to natural gas. Our electricity emissions are going down. And then just recently from Jackie Mann, and how forest coverage is actually increasing despite the loss of land cover around Atlanta and other growing places. So I think the two of those more than compensate for increased population and increased usage of electricity. So I'd say that has surprised me. And I noticed someone in the chat was surprised by that as well. Okay, Blair?
That's great. Ollie, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. So a lot of great questions. I don't think we'll be able to get through all of them, but I think I'd like to start us off with one of the last questions that were asked was how difficult would it be to replicate this tracker for another state? They are specifically for Virginia. Is the methodology available for other states to utilize?
We are thinking about exactly that. And we made the choice to use open source software to develop all of our estimates, even though the tracker is actually in Microsoft Power BI. but we're using open source analytical software, and all of our data sources have been national data sources that are publicly available. And so, although it would take some work to rewrite the code for another state, we tried to keep in mind that we would not use any proprietary data, and we would not use data specific to Georgia. So it would make it as easy as possible to replicate the tracker and the analysis behind it for multiple states. Marilyn Brown, do you want to make a comment here?
Well, I was going to say along those lines, it's also not terribly expensive to sustain the updating of our current dashboard, on a monthly basis. We have plans to do that. And the price tag for that is very modest. And I believe we have good coverage going forward for that. So, yeah, there's a little bit of, expense to get it set up for each state. I would like to see regions also collectively characterized. I would really like the Southeast to go whole hog into, every state in the Southeast having a dashboard. So, yep, that's one of our aspirations.
There are a couple of people who are interested about soil carbon capture and whether it was included in our analysis, and if not, is it possible to incorporate in the future?
Soils, as you all know, are critically important. I like to point out, because I love my trees, that the only way to really get the carbon into the soils is through the trees. Soils can have forms of carbon that exist, safely sequestered out of the atmosphere for centuries, some for millennia. Getting the carbon to the soils is in some ways the name of the game. This data is from the EPA, and the EPA does include the top meter of soils. So we're talking trees, and we're importantly talking soils. And I'm sure that, as the question asker knows, we have more carbon stored in soils than we do have carbon stored in all the Earth's vegetation and the atmosphere combined. Soils really rock. And I know that was a clever pun. Thank you.
We have quite a specific question regarding some industries around Augusta. So what options are there for plants like fertilizer plants or cement plants to reduce carbon when it's part of their manufacturing process? Are there carbon capture, different manufacturing methods, etc.?
So I'll take the first crack and say that I'm not an expert on fertilizer manufacturing, so I'm going to actually stay away from that one and just say, certainly you would want to look at the processes and see whether there are substitutions. And in manufacture of cement, which I'm also not an expert in, but do know that there are other additives to manufacturing of cement that are being explored that do dramatically reduce the carbon emissions associated with cement manufacturing. And so a lot of that's already been tested and proven out. It's a matter of bringing it to scale and continuing to demonstrate the efficacy of alternative mixes into the cement manufacturing process.
I might add, for manufacturing processes that use a lot of heat, people are exploring the substitution of hydrogen gas that can be created from low carbon or zero carbon electricity. It seems to me, I'm not an expert, but it's a feasible path, although it's a path that has not been researched nearly as extensively as we might like to make the transition from burning fossil fuels to burning zero carbon hydrogen for high heat manufacturing processes.
If I could add really quickly, another role of the amazing Georgia forests is something called mass timber or cross-laminated timber. These, several of us have worked on ideas on this. We could potentially use the timber from Georgia to make I call them high-tech lumber, like super fancy plywood. It sounds funny, but what these things do is they swap out cement and even steel in building construction. They've been used. We have buildings around the planet about 20-meter stories tall, and that's a way of using a renewable source of stuff to build big buildings, and bypasses all the cement and carbon polluting effects of steel and other much more commonly used. I'll be quiet there.
So another question was concerned about cogeneration. So this is a solution we've highlighted as an optimal solution for Georgia. And they're curious, while such solutions would reduce emissions overall for the state, there's the potential to increase the emissions for where the plant is located. So the question is, does cogeneration drive up the emissions tracker for the particular county it would be installed in? And I suppose that drives questions about equity concerns of where we may install these plants that have an overall benefit for the state, but may have a detrimental impact on where they're installed.
So Ollie, I could take that one of my favorite technologies. Yes, of course, sometimes the co-location of an electricity plant that's using waste heat from an industrial process can be near to high populous areas. So you have to be very careful that you're not driving up emissions in highly populated places. These CHP plants are really a great foundation for going forward with novel and innovative clean energy options with very high levels of efficiency ranging from 85 to 95% compared to a gas plant, let's say, that might be 65% efficient. So your level of efficiency, and then adding, of course, pollution equipment on those plants would help immensely, as we always do, as best as possible. But I did want to note that cogeneration going forward is likely to use renewable gas and green hydrogen as blends over the next decade with traditional natural gas, and eventually could go 100% green with green and renewable fuels. So I think then we would not have to worry about any conventional pollutants being made more local. So I'm looking at the kind of next decade where we'll have that supplement, that substitution of fossil to renewable gas driving those plants and running at such high efficiencies.
I think we have time for one more question. So we'll end on, are there any plans to add a modeling component to this dashboard to test out how various solutions can be applied and accelerated for the state of Georgia?
That's our dream. Go ahead, take it away, Bill.
I'll say quickly, but the real payoff, I think, will be in tracking solutions. And we don't want to just track emissions, but if we track our progress in solutions, that can have multiple positive effects on accelerating those solutions. That neighboring counties will see what the next county is doing. Businesses in a particular industry will see what other businesses are doing. And so tracking the solutions would be a terrific way to try and accelerate adoptions of those solutions. Marilyn, why don't you take the last word here?
Well, that's what Drawdown Georgia is all about. We have to understand where emissions come from in order to know what solutions are most important. But obviously, our real excitement is all around the solution space. And so we've identified 20. There are more than 20. I And we have now partnered with business leaders that have innovative ideas for more that can be done. So we're going to be moving pretty quickly now into geospatial tracking of solutions and linking back to emission streams. So thank you all very much. I imagine, Blair, you probably have some concluding comments, huh?
Well, that was a pretty good conclusion. I'll just add thank you again on behalf of the Ray C. Anderson Foundation and the entire Drawdown Georgia team. We hope you will now go and check out the tracker on the Drawdown Georgia website and continuing to come back in the days and weeks to come. As Dr. Drummond mentioned, the data is going to be kept up to date monthly, so we can all keep track of how emissions are going in the places that we live and work and love as we work to reduce emissions in our state. So thank you again. We really appreciate you joining us today.
Bye, everybody. Thanks.